I'm going to go ahead and get started. I am Rob Howard. I'm a program manager on the Office Extensibility team. And today we are indeed going to get our hands dirty with the Office 365 APIs. Thank you very much for getting up early, making it here at 9 o'clock, all the way over to this really far away conference room to listen to the talk. I will give you one real quick word of warning, which is that this is an exhausting session. I'm going to be exhausted when we're done. I'm going really fast, packing a lot of stuff in. I'm going to go really deep. We're going to do all kinds of protocol flows and REST API calls and OAuth things. If you don't feel like you're up for that in the morning and you want to go find one more session, take it a little slower. I won't have my feelings hurt, but you've been warned. With that, I will go ahead and get started for the rest of you guys who are willing to participate. I'm going to start off with a really quick intro, just recapping why you would want to bring Office 365 APIs, Office 365 services, identity into your applications. And then we're going to jump right in and go through single sign-on and how you allow people to take their Office 365 identity and sign into your application. We're going to do that in a bunch of detail. And we're going to take that, and once you've signed them in, we're going to get access to their services in Office 365, their calendars, their organizational directory, their files in OneDrive for Business, and make your apps richer. And then, after we've gone through all the nitty-gritty protocol details of how all that stuff works under the covers, and you guys are all REST and OAuth and OpenID Connect experts, we're going to look at a bunch of the tools so that you don't ever have to do those things at the protocol level again. You can use our tools and our SDKs. And when everything works correctly, you can be much more productive and efficient with those tools and SDKs. All right, so you guys may have seen a slide like this or this slide before. This is kind of how we think about the Office developer platform as a whole. We think about there as being two big kind of pieces to it. One is all about the user experience. Office is a collection of applications where people go to get stuff done. A ton of people use it. They do a ton of work there. They spend a bunch of time in there. It's part of their workflow. One big thing about the Office Developer Platform is allowing developers to take custom experiences and adding them in directly inside of Office so that you can bring your services, your custom experiences, your custom data in their workflow. And if you saw like Rob and Jeremy's session, they showed a bunch of examples of that. Rolando Jimenez has a section just on all the different places where you can put custom experiences inside of Office. We're going to be focused on the second item, which is all about data. And that data in Office 365, people's mail, their calendar, their contacts, their user directory, and your ability to get to that data from custom applications that are running on devices, that are service applications, applications running in the browser, and make your applications richer by integrating that data. You guys might have seen this quote. We're really happy about this quote, so we put it up everywhere. When we introduced the Office 365 APIs last year, Satya Nadella said that they're the most strategic developer surface for Microsoft. I'll give you my take on why I think that is, and that's because if you're an Office 365 user, that identity is what you do to get your job done. That's how you do your work every day. It's how you accomplish things. It's the canonical source for what am I doing at this hour? Where am I? Where am I going? What's my next appointment? It's the way that you communicate and collaborate with people. It's the collection of all the files you're using on whatever project you're building in OneDrive for Business. So if you can take all of that really important data that's sort of the lifeblood of an organization and you can build custom applications in a really simple, straightforward way with it, that's a really strategic and powerful thing. So how does it start? Well, the first step is just single sign-on. It's as simple as just saying, hey, I have an application and I want to let my users sign into it with their Office 365 identity, the identity that they're using to get work done. Office 365's identity, the directory and identity platform, is actually based on Azure Active Directory. So when you go and create an Office 365 tenant, you get this Azure Active Directory tenant underneath it. When you're signing into Office 365, you're signing in with Azure Active Directory. And Azure Active Directory is a really rich ecosystem for organizational sign-in. You can see a bunch of numbers here. There's over 5 million organizations that have their identity managed in the cloud with Azure Active Directory. 86% of Fortune 500 companies are using Microsoft services that depend on Azure Active Directory. You see over 1 billion authentications every day into Azure Active Directory. So it's a really rich and vibrant ecosystem. If you're building a productivity application, whether it's one that you're selling to companies, that you're building custom for a company, or that you're building for your own company, signing in with Azure Active Directory, using that identity natively inside of your application so your users don't have to get a new username and password is kind of a no-brainer. So how does that work? How does that plug into Office 365? Well, we use Azure Active Directory as the source of kind of the single protocol that applications use to authenticate to Office 365. And the first step is signing in with what has become kind of the standard protocol for signing users into cloud services, OpenID Connect. And we'll go through that protocol in a ton of detail. You'll see every last little bit of how that protocol works and what tokens you get where. But that's the first step. That's how your application knows, here's who the user is, here's how their name is, so I can say, hello, Rob. Here's how I can create a new profile for them. The next step is that you then ask the user, hey, can I have access to this data, to these services on your behalf? And we allow you, through Azure Active Directory, to connect to the directory itself. So you can do things like, who are the users, what groups are they a member of, who's their manager, who reports to them, what department are they in, all that good stuff. To Exchange, so you can get to their mailbox, to their calendar, the meetings, the contacts they have, and leverage those in your applications. To SharePoint and OneDrive for Business, so you can get to lists and libraries and the files that they've stored in the cloud. And now we've actually got in preview support for Azure Active Directory to connect to a bunch of new services, like Yammer, the OneNote service for interacting with notes and APIs. I'll show you some of that stuff. We've even got stuff for Video Portal. We've got management activity APIs. So it's a really growing ecosystem of services that you can get to with that same auth flow. And you can use that auth flow regardless of where your app is. If you're building a device app on iOS or Android, you can use this. If you're building a website or web application, regardless of what platform you're using, you can sign users in with this. We've recently added support for a protocol called, or a capability called CORS, Cross-Origin Resource Sharing, that allows you to do requests across domains in the browser, so that from single-page apps running in the browser that are just HTML and JavaScript, you can also call all of these services. And we've also added support for something called App Only. So if you have a service application that wants to make calls into, say, Exchange in order to manage a bunch of Exchange mailboxes, or do some maintenance across a broad set of activities, or provision a whole bunch of resources for users, things that a user wouldn't typically have the permissions to do, we now have support for that, so service applications can be built against these same APIs with those same flows. And when you create your application, it gets access through either admin or end user consent. That means that you can either say, hey, I want to bring my application to my organization or to another organization by going directly through the tenant administration. And that administration can then approve my application, and it can get access to all of the users, access to data for the entire tenant on behalf of all of its users. Or I can connect directly with end users and ask each end user individually, hey, give me access to your data so that I can build my application individually, and I don't have to go through an IT department. Of course, we have controls in place so that an IT department can say, I'd like to lock that down, so that I can approve applications before end users can interact with them. But the vast majority of organizations allow their end users to connect their data directly. And all this is based on a couple of secure protocols that are industry standard across a variety of services today, OpenID Connect and OAuth 2. They have a bunch of advantages over, say, just typing in a username and password. The biggest one is that you're not typing in a username and password. When you do that, not only does the user have to type a username and password in every application they want to connect with, but then the application has to store that securely. They have to figure out somehow how to keep that. The application, once it has your username and password, is acting just like you. So if you're a tenant administrator and you can do things like wipe your entire tenant's worth of data, or take out all of the organizational hierarchy and pull out all of their mailboxes, an application that has your username and password can do that exact same thing. So OAuth allows you to give more fine-grained access. So the app has to actually ask, here's the specific resource, I want to get to your calendar, or I want to read your contacts, and it can only do those things. It also allows you to support, in a really simple, straightforward way, protocols that are really important for enterprises, things like multi-factor authentication and federated sign-in, where you have a bunch more complicated sign-in flows for the end user. OpenID Connect and OAuth make that really transparent to the application developer, and I'll actually demo that in just a minute. And then the last is that this protocol also allows you to get long-term access through refresh tokens. So after your app has been given access to a user's data, you can use a refresh token until your application's rescinded or removed from the user's data. You can use that refresh token to continue to access their data even when they're not interactively working with your application. So you can do smart things for them while they're sleeping. You can check their data periodically and do smart things based on changes that happen behind the scenes. So refresh tokens are a really powerful capability there as well. So I'm actually going to go really quickly and kind of describe the flow, how OpenID Connect and OAuth work in a quick protocol diagram. On the left-hand side, you'll see your application. And this is pretty much true for all application types. There's some variations depending on the type. But whether it's a device app or a web app, you've got your application on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, you have an Office 365 REST API. So say you want to get to your Exchange calendar, and you want to pull back the events that are on that calendar. In the middle, there's a couple of endpoints that are hosted by Azure Active Directory. One's called the authorization endpoint, and one's called the token endpoint. And the first step to this is that your application sends the user to the authorization endpoint. And you can think of the authorization endpoint as basically a web page. It's the web page that is sort of the prototypical dialog in OAuth where it says, hey, do you want to give the app access to this stuff, to get to your calendar, to read your contacts, etc. That web page is going to force the user to sign in if they're not already signed in. If they're already signed in, it'll just ask them for, do you want to give this app access? And if the user says yes, the authorization endpoint creates what's called an authorization code. And it sends that authorization code back to the application. The application turns around and sends the authorization code in a web service call to a token endpoint. So that's the second OAuth endpoint. And then the token endpoint returns a bunch of tokens. It's very creatively named. And it returns 3 tokens, the ID token, the access token, and the refresh token. If you're just doing single sign-on in OpenID Connect, the ID token is actually where you stop. You just take that ID token. It's got all the information that you need in order to sign the user in. You can say, hi, Rob, we know who you are. We'll create a new user profile for you. If you want to get access to, say, some Office 365 data on their behalf, then you take that access token and you send that in a header in the API request to say, hey, I'd like to go get this user's calendar information, and this access token proves who I am and who the user is. And then the API returns that data, say a list of the user's calendar events, back to your application, and you can use it in whatever way you'd like. So this is the protocol. I'm actually going to switch over, and I'm going to demo the whole thing from end to end, from scratch, without any libraries or anything like that. We're going to do it just in the browser and with a couple of web tools. So let me switch over. I'm going to start, after I sign in, I'm going to start in the Office 365 admin portal. How many people have seen this portal? A lot of people. OK. So if you haven't, this is the admin portal in Office 365. If you're a tenant administrator, this is one of the applications you get. This is where you go to administer your tenant. You can see I'm in a tenant very creatively named Rob's Developer Tenant. It's very hard to remember. I've got a couple of different types of data on the left-hand side I can manage. I'll point out 2. One is users. So if I click on active users, for example, you can see a list of users that are in this tenant. And the other is groups. And you can see a list of groups that are inside here as well. This is where I can go to create new ones, to assign licenses, all that good stuff. If I go down to the bottom, you'll see a link to Azure AD. Remember I said when you created an Office 365 tenant, under the covers, we're actually going and creating an Azure AD tenant for you. That's your directory. That's where all the users are actually stored. If I click on that, it'll walk me through creating a new Azure subscription if I don't have one. And then I'll end up in the Azure AD management portal. So this is the Azure management portal. Hopefully people are pretty familiar with that. You'll see that I've got a directory here as part of my Azure AD resources called Rob's Developer Tenant, matches the name of the organization in Office 365. And if I click on that and I go to the Users tab, you'll see all the same users that were in Office 365. And if I create a user here, they'll show up in Office 365 and vice versa. So this is the underlying directory system for Office 365 that if you're just staying in the admin portal in Office 365, you may not even really know exists, because you can do all your user and group management tasks from there. One of the things that's not there in the Office 365 admin portal is a way to manage applications. So I'll go to this Applications tab, and you'll see a bunch of applications that are in my tenant, some of which are published by me, Rob's Developer Tenant, some of which are coming from other tenants. You can see Microsoft Corporation, AD Graph. When you first show up, actually, what you'll probably see here in an Office 365 tenant is just a couple of applications. So if I filter for Office 365, you'll see Office 365 Exchange Online and SharePoint Online that were published by Microsoft Corporation. So these are actually the application principals for those services. And they're part of the Microsoft tenant. We model them the same way that you're going to model your own applications. So in this tenant, you're seeing them because they have access to some data in your tenant. And you can manage that access from this same place. If I want to create a new application, I go down here to the bottom, and I click Add. I can go to a gallery. If somebody's created an application and published it for me to use, I can add that. In this case, I just want to create one that my organization is creating. I'm going to call it Ignite Demo. And I can choose whether I want a web application or a native client. I'm going to choose web application because it's a little more complicated, requires a little bit more information, so I can explain a couple more things. The first thing I need to give it is a sign-on URL. And this is a web application, so this is just the URL where the site's going to be, basically. And I'm going to call it http://made-up-website. I used to actually say that this was not actually a registered domain, and then in one talk when I said that, somebody in the audience during the talk went and registered the domain, so it's actually registered now. But there's really no website there still, so I'll still use it. The other is app ID URI, and this one's a little bit unfortunate, honestly. This is a parameter that you don't use in OAuth. It's used for more complicated protocols like SAML-P and WSFed and things, hopefully, that you'll never, ever have to learn. I actually still have to put it in here, even though we're not actually going to use it. The strategy I use is I just take the tenant name. So this tenant's called Junction, so all the users are like junction.onmicrosoft.com. You can just take that tenant name and use it as a domain. That's already a verified domain. And then just put something unique after it to make sure it doesn't conflict with anything else. So I'm typing a bunch of junk. Hopefully it's unique. Hit OK. And now I've got a new application called Ignite Demo. I can go to the Configure tab, and I can see a bunch of different metadata about that application. Here's the name. Here's the sign-on URL I just typed in. I can give it a new logo if I'd like. I can configure whether this application is multi-tenant or not. And I'm going to leave that as no for now, but I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. The next piece of information is called the client ID. And you can think of this as like a username for my application. So this is the unique identifier for my application. I'm going to use it in a bunch of different places along the protocol. Next is keys, which you can kind of think of as a password for my application. And I'm going to create a new one that'll last a year. It's a little annoying that it won't actually show it to me until I hit save. But I'm going to come back and grab it after I hit save. App ID URI, we already talked about that. And then the last one here is reply URL. And remember in the diagram how we had the authorization endpoint? When the user said, yeah, I want to give you access, we send back an authorization code. That code is going to go to whatever we put as the reply URL. So in this case, we're going to send that code to madeupwebsite.com. I could put a path underneath that if I wanted to, but this is a made-up website, so it doesn't have a path, and I'm just going to leave it as made-up website. The last and most interesting piece is permissions to other applications. And you'll see by default that it's asking for permission in Windows Azure Active Directory to enable sign-on and read users' profiles. So that's the default permission. This is what's going to allow me to do OpenID Connect and to get a username for that user and to get their name and their last name and first name, all that kind of good stuff. But I can also add a bunch of other services here. Any service that has exposed permissions to Azure Active Directory and is in my tenant will be here. You can see things like Exchange Online, which I'm going to add, and SharePoint Online. You can see OneNote here, Power BI. There's also applications for Yammer now. So there's a bunch of different things that I can add. I can even create custom applications and expose custom permissions through this same dialog so that you can request them through Azure Active Directory as well. If I hit OK, you'll see Exchange and SharePoint added here. I'm going to go to delegated permissions, and these are all the permissions that my app can request. And they'll show up on that authorization endpoint as the things that I'm asking the user for. So I'm going to say read and write user contacts, read and write user calendars, send mail as user, read and write user mail. Check a bunch of these things. In SharePoint Online, I'm going to do run search queries, read and write user files. We actually have some new SharePoint Online permission scopes that were just added in the last couple of weeks for managed metadata and user profiles. Search is relatively new. So a lot of the permissions that used to be only available through the SharePoint app model are now available also to Office 365 APIs. And then I'm going to hit save. Actually, one other thing that I'll show you is that there's also this notion of application permissions. On the right-hand side, you saw delegated permissions. And those are the permissions that I'm asking for an end user to delegate to me, to my application. The application permissions are ones that the application gets directly. So the application isn't asking a user for them. These are app-only permissions. That's for those service application scenarios we were talking about before. So if you look at the names, there'll be things like read and write mail in all mailboxes. So a pretty privileged application. This is something that a tenant administrator would install to do, say, management operations across an entire tenant. In this case, I'm going to stick with delegated permissions. I hit save, so I'm ready to go. I'll show you one other thing inside of the portal, and then I'll go run through the flow. If you click on View Endpoints in the bottom, you'll see a little dialog that shows you a bunch of different URLs. And some of those are those really complicated protocols like WSFed and SAML-P that we can kind of ignore. At the bottom, you'll see two things that hopefully sound familiar. OAuth 2 authorization endpoint and OAuth 2 token endpoint. So hopefully those sound familiar from the diagram. I'm going to actually take the authorization endpoint to start from there. One thing I'll point out, though, is that the one that's inside of here actually has a GUID in the second segment. So you can see this GUID here, and it goes this GUID, then OAuth2, then authorize is the URL. If I go to this little scratch pad of URLs I have here, you'll see the same OAuth2/authorize URL here, but instead of using that GUID, I'm using common for that segment. That's because I want this to work across all tenants. So if I want to target a single tenant, I can kind of hard code that tenant URL, that tenant ID inside the authorization endpoint, but I'm putting common there to make it multi-tenant. And then I have to add a couple of parameters to it. The first is, what's the redirect URI? And that's, again, just the URL where we're going to send the authorization code after the user says yes. And the second is, what type of response do I want? And I want that authorization code, so I'm just telling response type equals code. And the last thing I have to do is just paste in the client ID. And Azure Active Directory gave me that guy. So I'm just going to go up here and copy it and paste it in here. And now I've got my authorization URL. So I'm going to go into Chrome, and I'm signed in with Rob's developer tenant right now where I created the application. I'm going to create an incognito window. So I'm not signed in yet. And I'm going to go ahead and paste this in. First thing it's going to ask me to do is sign in. Let me make this a little bit bigger. First thing it's going to ask me to do is sign in. And I'm actually going to sign in with a user from a different tenant. In fact, I'm going to sign in with my actual Microsoft.com account. So this is the real Microsoft account that I use for work. And I'm going to sign in with that account for two reasons. One is because I want to show you what it looks like when I'm signing in with a separate tenant from the one that created the application. And two is because Microsoft's IT department does something that I consider really obnoxious, which is they've set up multi-factor authentication whenever I'm not on the corporate network. So when I take my mouse off of my username, it's going to recognize, oh, there's a bunch of extra stuff you have to do. And it's going to send me off to Microsoft IT's corporate sign-in. I can sign in with a smart card, or I can sign in with my username and password. If I do this, then it gets really fun, because they're actually going to call my phone. Hold on a second. I've got my phone here. Hopefully they'll call my phone. Hopefully I have reception here. They're going to call my phone and ask me for a PIN before they'll finish the login. So this is all that multi-factor authentication stuff at work. Oh, there I got the call. Usually I try not to answer phone calls during my presentations. I'll make an exception here. Type in my PIN, and my sign-in finished. So you see an error there, but I actually signed in. That error is on purpose. I'll talk about that in just a second. So let's talk about what we just saw. I went to that authorization endpoint. I signed in with my Microsoft account. I had to do all these extra hoops for multi-factor authentication. I was actually federated with an on-prem ADFS. There's a bunch of other stuff going on. The application didn't do anything about that. It really didn't even know at that point that that was going on. All of that interstitial stuff is kind of free when you do OpenID Connect in OAuth2, which is a really nice feature of the protocol. So I did get an error, though. So let's talk about what that is. The error is here because you are almost certainly, if you try and do this at home, going to run into an error at some point when you copy and paste and construct URLs manually. I will almost certainly run into an error before the end of this demo. It's actually pretty tough to do manually. That's why we have libraries that we'll talk about at the end. When you do, it's really nice to know what the errors are like. In the top right-hand corner, you'll see an end-user-facing error that is almost totally useless. It says, sign in, sorry, but we're having trouble signing you in. Great. We received a bad request, which just means that it doesn't like the authorization endpoint request. So if you're a developer, you actually want to look at the bottom right in this really small ghosted gray text that they're really trying to hide. And you can see this area here at the bottom that says application with identifier, and then it's got a GUID, which happens to be the GUID for the client ID that I just created. Was not found in directory, and then there's another GUID, which happens to be the Microsoft IT tenant directory. So does anybody know why that is? Anybody? I just created it, doesn't exist there. The reason why it doesn't exist, yeah, the application is not registered there. And the reason why it's not registered there is because when I went back, remember I said the application is not multi-tenant. This toggle is actually the key to this one. So I created the application in Rob's developer tenant. If I left that as no, and somebody in Rob's developer tenant came to sign in, they wouldn't see that problem. They would be able to go straight ahead. So if you're building an application just for your own organization, you want to leave this as no, because you don't really want somebody from some other company signing into your application. If you're building an application and you want people from other organizations, whether that's just a couple of partners and you want to actually validate that there's somebody you know, or you really want anybody who is an Office 365 customer to use your application, then you want to go ahead and click yes. You want it to be a multi-tenant application, and you want to hit save. And this is a good time for me to tell you that when you make updates to running applications in Azure Active Directory, they have an eventually consistent model. So sometimes it can take like 20 to 30 seconds for it to propagate to all the different front ends worldwide that run Azure Active Directory. So if you do a demo, you have to kind of tap dance up here for like 15 seconds and waste a little bit of time. And then you can go back and cross your fingers and say, hopefully everything's come through. I will copy and paste that same authorization URL. This time, ADFS already has me signed in, so this should be pretty quick. And if we cross our fingers and hope that everything went through already and everything's been updated, great. So this is the actual authorization endpoint. This is that consent experience. So you can see, here's the name of my application, Ignite Demo. It's telling me what URL it's on, madeupwebsite.com. I can see, do I trust madeupwebsite.com? Here's all of the boxes that I checked. So I checked a bunch of them. It says read and write your contacts, read and write your calendars. I won't go through all of them. End users can kind of mouse over these guys to get a little bit more detail about what that means. And then it tells me who I'm signed in as, rhoward@microsoft.com. I can even get more details. So if I show details, I can see what organization I'm part of, Microsoft, and what organization has published the application. So I can see Rob's developer tenant listed right here as the application publisher. And I can say, oh, that Rob guy is pretty shady. I really don't want to give him access to my stuff, so I'm going to hit cancel. And then the application will never get access to your stuff. If I hit accept, which is what I'm going to do, because that Rob guy is pretty cool, I'm going to first start Fiddler in order to capture what happens when I hit accept. How many people have used Fiddler? Oh, awesome. Like everybody. Great. I'm not even going to explain what Fiddler is then. OK, so I'm going to start capturing, and then I'm going to go back here, and I'm going to hit accept. And what you're going to see is kind of an error, because, again, the IP address is registered, but it's not a real website. But let me go stop Fiddler from capturing so I don't get an extra bunch of traffic. If you look in the URL bar, you can see it's madeupwebsite.com, but in the query string you can see code equals, and then this long, really pretty, beautiful string that is the authorization code. So it actually sent the authorization code to madeupwebsite.com on the reply URL that I specified, or redirect URI that I specified. So now I've got my authorization code. Remember we said the next step was the website turns around and it makes a web service request to the token endpoint. So I'm actually going to do that, and I'm going to do that with Fiddler. I'm going to come into Fiddler. You can see all the requests that were made during the time that I was capturing here on the left-hand side. I'm actually just going to take this one to made up website, and I'm going to remove everything but that one. You can see in the right-hand side, if I go to, say, web forms view, you can see all the parameters that were made as part of that request, including that code, which I'm going to need. And to make the request to the token endpoint, I'm actually going to use Fiddler's Composer feature, which lets you create new traffic rather than just listen to traffic. And I'm going to take the URL for the token endpoint, which is the same as the authorization endpoint, except instead of OAuth2/authorize, it's OAuth2/token. So pretty reasonably named. And I'm going to paste that in here in the URL bar. And then instead of doing a GET request, I'm going to do a POST request, because I'm going to send it a bunch of information that I'm going to prove that I deserve this access token with. I'm going to get rid of the user agent, and I'm going to take this URL encoded kind of form body and paste it in, and I'll walk through that. It's got a bunch of parameters. The first is I'm telling it what I'm using to prove that I was granted access by the user. So my grant type, in this case, is an authorization code. We'll see a different grant type in just a minute. The redirect URI, again, is that URI where the authorization code was sent, and it's making me send it again just to make sure that it actually matches. It wants to know, hey, this authorization code wasn't actually sent to a different URL along the way. Then I need to give it the client ID. So here's the client ID piece. If I go back into Active Directory, I can copy that guy and paste it in. Then I need the client secret, which is this key down here. I'm going to copy that guy. One thing that's a little bit obnoxious about the client secret is it's not by default URL safe, so I actually have to encode it. When I was preparing for this, it was really cool. I went to Bing, I searched for URL encoder. Look at this, they actually put a URL encoder inline in the search results, which is pretty awesome. So I'm going to paste that in and hit encode and copy that out. And I'm going to paste that in the secret parameter, client secret parameter. And then I need the code, which again was in this request up here. So I'll go to Web Forms and copy the code, go back to Composer and paste the code in. And then the last thing I need is the resource. And the resource is how I tell Azure Active Directory what service I want an access token to. So do I want an access token to Exchange or SharePoint or Azure Active Directory? In this case, I actually want an access token to something called the Discovery Service, which I'll tell you about in just a minute. And the way I do that is I basically give the URL for where that service is. And the Discovery Service is on api.office.com/discovery. If I typed everything in right and I hit execute, you'll see a new request here for login.windows.net. I get a 200 back, so that's a good sign. If I look at the response, I get a bunch of headers and a 200 OK, and then I get a JSON body in the bottom. If I use the JSON viewer in Fiddler, I can see a nicer view there, and I got a bunch of parameters and tokens back. The first one I'm going to talk about is the ID token. And the ID token, if you remember, that's the one that is the OpenID Connect token. This is if I'm just doing SSO where I can stop. I just take this token and I'm done. And that's because this token is what's called a JOT token, which is how you say JWT, JSON Web Token. And the reason I know that is because the spec's first sentence is how you pronounce it. It's called JOT, not JWAT or something like that. I guess they were really trying to avoid like the GIF versus GIF debate in that whole thing. If I go to, for example, and what a JOT token is it's a base 64 encoded string that's then signed to make sure you can verify it, that internally in the string is just JSON. So it's a pretty simple token type and pretty easy to parse from any sort of language. If I go to calebb.net, he's actually got a JOT decoder that's just a web-based JOT decoder. So it's pretty nice. If I go in here and I copy the ID token, and I go back to calebb.net and paste it in, one thing that's annoying about the Fiddler JSON viewer is it includes the key on the front, so make sure to delete the ID token equals part. Then you get this JOT token. So like I said, you're just unencoding it, verifying the signature. You can see the signature part on the bottom. And then you've got JSON. And the JSON has a bunch of stuff inside it that tells me who the user is. And actually, calebb.net is cool because you can mouse over each one of the claims, and it will show you what that claim is intended for and where it came from. So the audience here, AUD stands for audience. This is actually the client ID for that application that I created. This is who is this token intended for. Then I've got a tenant ID. This is what organization is they're part of. So this is actually the tenant ID for Microsoft.com, for Microsoft's IT tenant. If you were building an application, say, where you didn't want anybody to be able to access it, but just your organization and maybe a couple of other specific organizations, you would use this field to validate that this was from an organization that you had a relationship with. Then there's the object ID, which is a unique identifier for the user. Then there's, say, given name. So my first name, Rob, and my family name, Howard Office. There are like 5 Rob Howards at Microsoft, which is really obnoxious, so I have to be very specific, Office. And then, actually, this one's really cool, too. There's this thing called authentication methods reference, which is actually an array. And these are all of the things that the user did to sign in. So if I have an application that says, oh, this is super secret data, and a password's not good enough, that's what this PWD means, is that I use a password. I also have MFA in here, multi-factor authentication, because I use that as well to sign in. So you, as an OpenID Connect client, can look at what were all the methods that were used to sign this user in as part of this token. And at this point, I'm kind of done. Like, I can connect this to whatever my user profile system is. Maybe I have a database that I maintain of users, and I create a new row in there, and I start maintaining database on them. But I'm kind of done. I've got my whole single sign-on flow. I can say, hi, Rob Howard Office. We know who you are. Welcome back, whatever. And I'm good to go. So OpenID Connect. Yay. Everybody give yourselves a round of applause. You're now OpenID Connect experts. You know exactly what you're doing there. We're going to go back, though, and we're going to keep going. I know, it's a lot of stuff. We're going to keep going, and we're going to make an API call. We're going to use OAuth in order to make an API call first to the Discovery Service. And the Discovery Service is a service that tells us where all the other services are for this user. Because you have a token, the token's giving you access to a bunch of stuff. Say, some stuff in SharePoint, some stuff in Exchange. You may not know where the URLs are for all that stuff. Some of the URLs are specific to a user, like in the case of SharePoint, where's their My Site. Some of them are specific to a tenant, some of them are global. So the Discovery Service actually helps you deal with all of that. And the way I'm going to call it is I'm actually going to copy this access token, and I'm going to go back to the composer and delete all this stuff. And I'm going to make a GET request to api.office.com/discovery. I'm going to use the v1 endpoint there, and I'm going to call an API called me/services. And this means give me all the services for the authenticated user based on this token. And the way I send the token is the same way that I send the token to any of the APIs that are Office 365 APIs. I say authorization header, and then I type in the string bearer, as in this is a bearer token, and a space, and then I just paste in that authorization token, that access token. And I have to remember again to delete that access token equals part. Otherwise, you'll get strange errors. OK, then I hit execute. And again, if I did everything right, I should get a response from api.office.com. If I look at that response, what you'll see is a list of all of the services that I have access to based on that token. So the first one you'll see here is a capability called My Files. The service endpoint for this particular user is microsoft-my.sharepoint.com, and here's the API endpoint. Here's the resource ID when you want to get an access token for it. You can see that one's for My Files. There's one here for contacts. There's one here for mail. There's one here for calendar. If I asked for access to the directory, you'd see one for Azure Active Directory as well. So this is a great way to make sure your application doesn't have to hard code a bunch of URLs or try and guess what the URL is based on the username. It can just automatically connect to the URLs that you have access to. So that's the discovery service, and that's often the first step for setting up a new user. Let's actually make a real API call to a real API, though. We're going to call the outlook.office365.com endpoint in order to interact with calendar. Where's calendar? Here's calendar, and you can see the service endpoint is outlook.office365.com/API/v10, and the resource ID that I use to get an access token is just outlook.office365.com. So we're going to go get a new access token. We actually have to get an access token for each of the different URLs that we want to call. This time it's a lot easier. I can take that same request that I used to get the last access token, and I don't have to ask the user for anything because I have a refresh token, which I can use to go and get a new access token for as long as that refresh token is good, which by default is a rolling window of 6 months that continues to renew if users use your application, as long as they don't come and revoke it and say, hey, I don't like your application, it was doing weird stuff. So I'm going to go replay and reissue from Composer that request to the token endpoint. And that's just going to load into the Composer the exact same request that we made to get the first access token. And I'm going to change just a couple things. The first is, this time I'm not going to give it an authorization code. I'm going to give it a refresh token. So refresh_token is the grant type. And then I have to go and actually remove the whole code piece, because we're not going to use that anymore. Code equals long string. Select that and delete it. And then I want to go back to this request. Here's the refresh token that it gave me when I redeemed my authorization code originally. I'm going to copy that guy and go back to the Composer and paste it right where my code was. And then I'm going to change my resource. In this case, I'm going to do https://outlook.office365.com. And hit execute. And I get a 200 back, and this response again looks very similar. This time I don't get an ID token, because I didn't just sign the user in. I'm just getting a new one based on a refresh token. But I still get the access token and the refresh token. And I can use that access token to make a bunch of API calls. OK, so we did the original flow to get the OpenID Connect token. We signed the user in. We made a call to the discovery service. We found out where the user's services are. Now let's actually dive in and talk about the Office 365 APIs. And we're going to use a bunch of REST requests here in order to interact with, in this case, the calendar service. So the way I do that is similar to what I did with the discovery service. I'm going to start off by making a really simple GET request to the most basic kind of URL there, outlook.office365.com. And remember, the endpoint was API/v10. And the simplest request I can think of is just /me, which is going to say, hey, just tell me some basic information about the currently authenticated user. Again, I'm going to do the same sort of auth. I'm going to pass that access token in authorization bearer space and paste that in. And then I am going to remove the access token piece again and hit execute. And this response is going to come back with a 200 and give me some basic information about the user. So again, this is just really basic information. Rob, Howard, Office. I can get the mailbox squid, but other than that, it's not a particularly useful call. So let's do some more interesting ones. So I can do things like, for example, me/messages. And me/messages will give me back all the messages that are in my actual inbox in Outlook. If I look at the inspectors and I look at the raw response, it's a bunch of JSON. If I look at the actual JSON, it's actually pretty simple JSON. Hey, somebody favorited a tweet I was in. Thanks, Israel. So you can see information here like, here's the subject. Here's the 2 recipients. It was sent to my email address. You can see a web link to it. So if I wanted to link the user off to OA to see that message directly, I could get that from there. So it's really basic, simple JSON that describes this message in exactly the same way you'd expect. You can parse it. You can interact with it any way you'd like, from any platform you'd like, as long as you understand JSON. A couple of things here. I made an open-ended request to /messages. I just said, give me all of the messages. Obviously, I'm not going to give every last message in my inbox down in a single response. I have a lot of messages in my inbox. There would be no way. We'd be sitting here for a long time while that came through. So what we actually do is we kind of cut it off at the point that we think is reasonable for that first page. And you'll see at the top here, and this is consistent for all of the Office 365 APIs, if we cut off a response and there's another page, you'll see this @odata.next link thing. And this is how you know that this is a partial response and there's more information to go get. You can actually just turn around, take that exact same URL that's in there, and make the same request again, and you'll get the next page of data. And if there's another page after that, you'll have next link again. And you'll know you're done because there won't be a next link in there. So that's how you do paging in the Office 365 APIs. And if I want to actually specify how big I want a page, or say I want to have a smaller response, I only care about the first few, then I can use a URL parameter. So I'm going to go over and switch to me/events. And I'm going to say I only want the first 2 events that come back. And there's a URL parameter called $top, and I can put in the index, the integer, for the number of items that I'd like back. So I'm going to say $top equals 2. And again, I can do this on pretty much any collection in any of the Office 365 APIs, whether these are users inside of groups, whether these are inside of, whether it's your calendar, your contacts. It's a very consistent way to interact with them. And you'll see here in this events response that I only get back 2 objects because I asked for a top 2. You'll also see, though, that there's actually a bunch of data. We're giving you a ton of information about what's in this calendar event, the location, the organizer, a whole bunch of information about responses and when the reminder is. And my application may only care about a couple of these things. So another thing that all the Office 365 APIs support is you can add another parameter on here called $select. And you can give a comma-delimited list of all the fields that you'd like, and just those fields. So I can say $select ID, and give me the subject, and the start time, and I should probably know the location. And if I hit execute, then you'll see that in this response, I only get back those fields that I asked for. So I'm optimizing the bytes over the wire. I'm optimizing the amount of parsing that I have to do when I get the response in. I can get just the pieces of information that my application happens to care about in this particular case. And you see those 2 things compose with one another. So I only got those 2 responses. So I can do $top and $select together. And there's a few other parameters like that. So for example, I can use another parameter called $filter. So for example, if I want to say, hey, I'm just looking for the appointments that have a subject that EQs, equals. There's sort of this query language. I can do like equals or not equals, less than, greater than, contains, starts with. And I'm, in this case, going to say, for example, just the ones that are a soccer game. Soccer, I love soccer. Soccer game. And we'll see all the ones on my calendar that are soccer games. I'll hit execute. And if I look at the response, I should just see 2 appointments, and they're both soccer game appointments. The order is a little bit random, though. Like I have one from 2015, and I have one from 2009. I'd actually like to order it by, for example, the start. So another parameter we have is $order by, and I can just give the name of the field I'd like to order by. So $order by start, execute, and I look at that inspector. You can see all of those parameters. If I go to the web forms view, you can see all those parameters kind of stacked, $top, $select, $filter, $order by. And you can see that I get back just 2 items. First one's from 2007 and then from 2009. So it's ordered by the start date in there as well. And those parameters are consistent across all the Office 365 APIs. So if you understand how to use those parameters with that particular REST request, you can use them in all those different places. There are a couple of fields. Awesome. Thank you. There are a couple of fields, for example, where you can't do $filter and $order by. Like, if you tried to do $filter on the body of an email, it's not an indexed field from the filter perspective, so you actually get an error when you do $filter on the body. But we also have another one called $search, which if I go back here and do me/messages. And this is pretty new. So if you're familiar with the APIs and this one doesn't sound familiar, it's only been out for a couple of weeks, actually. If I go to messages and I do $search, and it's only supported on messages right now, but it'll get everywhere else. And I can say, for example, like from Yina. And I can use all the same syntax that I could use, say, inside Outlook, like from Yina and subject, whatever, and hit execute. And that'll actually go to my mailbox, and it'll run the search using the fast search index, so it's not using just the filtering index. And then it will return just the items that are from Yina. So if I say from Carolyn, actually she has an interesting conflict with that name. 2 recipients on the next one from Yina. So you can see that search then is running in that case against those particular fields. So search is another really powerful one, and it lets you work against even the places where you can't do $filter because it's too expensive for us to execute that query. And then, of course, one more demo about this particular service API. The APIs are not just read APIs. That would be a little bit lame. They also allow you to write data. So I'm going to go ahead and log into Office 365, and I'm going to go to my calendar. Man. That Twitter post is going wild. And I'm going to switch over to my calendar. You can see my calendar here. I'm going to put the calendar here, and I'm going to go to Fiddler. I'm going to make this one big. For those of you guys who are familiar with REST, this will sound really like I'm being very pedantic, but just in case you're not, the way that REST typically works is if I go to a URL like me/events, me/events is pretty obviously a collection of events. If I do a GET request on that, I'm getting back all of the events that are in that collection in JSON. The way you would add to that collection is you'd use the post verb. You'd say, OK, I'm going to post a new item to this collection. And then I just describe the item that I want to add in there. So I have to tell it what the content type is that I'm going to give it so it can know how to parse it. And the content type is just going to be application/JSON. So I'm going to just give it some simple JSON. And then this couldn't be actually simpler or cleaner as far as I can tell. I'm just going to say subject and testing. The one semi-complicated part of this is that time zones are really difficult, but that's not the API's fault, I guess. Oh, hey, it's Cinco de Mayo. I didn't realize that. Happy Cinco de Mayo, everybody. So what are we, -6 or something? Start, end. I'll put in a start and end date in UTC, 05. We'll end an hour later. 15 OZ. And then I'm done. I can actually go ahead and hit execute. And if I look at the response that I get back here, it gives me a 201, which is the HTTP response code for created. And if I go and refresh this guy, then you can see this new testing appointment on my calendar that was created through the APIs. So really simple, seamless ways to interact with these through simple, clean JSON. Really basic services that allow you to take advantage of all the cool stuff in Office 365. OK, so we're kind of done with the exhausting part. Thanks, guys. We got through the big, really difficult part. Hopefully, that was really useful to you guys. Hopefully, you really understand very deeply how OpenID Connect, OAuth, the flows, REST, all those things work at a basic level. I'm going to do just a couple of slides just to review what you saw, just to make sure we digest it. We saw the discovery service. Remember, that was a service that we used to automatically detect all of the URLs based on who the signed-in user is and what you have access to. Again, it supports all the device app and website flows. It uses Azure AD for auth. And all of that information is stored inside of Azure AD, so we know where to go. You saw the Office 365 APIs, which are a set of simple REST and OData APIs across a bunch of different services and a growing set of services. They have really simple, clean JSON. They support Azure Active Directory as their authentication mechanism. You can find their URLs through that discovery service. And you can interact with them from whatever platform you want, because it's just HTTP and JSON, so really simple and straightforward. And they work consistently across those surfaces. So things like the query string parameters and the style and the arrangement of those APIs should be similar even across those product boundaries. Here's a list of a bunch of the Office 365 APIs. There are actually even a couple missing. We have like this management activity API that I couldn't fit on the screen in time. But we have a bunch. We've had Azure Active Directory and Exchange Online and SharePoint Online and OneDrive for Business for a little while. Those are all getting new stuff all the time. There's a new version of the OneDrive for Business API. There's new stuff being added to Exchange Online. We just got that $search thing in there and time zone support, and they have a new Unified Groups API. So there's new stuff in those existing APIs. We also have a bunch of new APIs that we just released in the last couple of weeks in preview. So you can see things like OneNote. You can now interact with the OneNote API using Azure Active Directory Auth. Yammer's conversations, you can use those through Azure Active Directory-based authentications. The video portal, which is sort of an enterprise YouTube application for managing kind of channels and videos inside of it, those have Office 365 APIs. And now the unified groups infrastructure, that infrastructure for collaborating with a group of people across all these different workloads, you can actually interact with that through an Office 365 API as well. So there's a bunch of these different things, and pretty much all of them actually have a specific talk at some point this week. So if you're interested in the OneNote API, then go check out Gareth Jones's talk sometime this week. If you're interested in OneDrive for Business, unfortunately that talk is at the exact same time as this one, but you can watch it recorded. Ryan Gregg's giving that one. There's a talk that Venkat's giving on the Office 365 APIs in Exchange. So if you're interested in the details of a particular workload, you can definitely find that information this week, or you can go online. In particular, I'd check out this URL, AKMS Office 365 Dev APIs. In the past, our REST API documentation has left a lot to be desired. There's still room for improvement, but we're getting a lot better. This is actually a pretty good site for checking out all the different capabilities we have and trying it out. So I'm going to go real quick and just show you what that site looks like so you know where to go and you know why it's actually an interesting place to look. So if you go there, you'll find a whole bunch of Office 365 API reference. And if you actually, I think this is the page that you'll land on. This is probably the page you'll land on. If you go to Office 365 API reference, then you can interact with a whole bunch of different APIs. You can see Outlook Mail, you can see Outlook Contacts, whatever API you're interested in. You can click in, and you get a pretty in-depth article about using the API, but the coolest thing is you can actually see all the different operations that you can do. So along the right-hand side, as you scroll, you'll be sort of lined up with different operations. And you can click to say, hey, I want to get a message collection, all the messages. And it'll show you, here's the URL, here's the parameters that you can pass in, here's a sample request. And then you can actually, even in the browser, without signing in, go against a sample tenant and say, try it, give me an example of all of the sent items collection. And it'll actually return to you live from this sample tenant that request. And I can customize the parameters to say, oh, I want the inbox, and try that one instead, and it'll give you back the inbox. So if you're interested in looking at what's available and what are the capabilities there and trying out some sample requests, that's definitely a cool tool to try out. Okay, so that was the wrong one. One other thing that I did want to talk about. There were a couple of weird things about that. I'm sure you noticed a few places along the way when it seemed a little bit more complicated than maybe it had to be. For example, one thing that was hard about it is that all of these different APIs are on different URLs. So if you want to call Outlook, it's on outlook.office365.com. If you want to call OneDrive for Business, it's on Microsoft-my or whatever your tenant name is, -my.sharepoint.com. So they're all kind of on different URLs. That means I have to get different access tokens for them and go back and forth with that. It also means that if I want to do what's a totally natural scenario, like look at a file, look at the last user to modify it, find out what department they're in, or if they're out of the office right now, or who their manager is, I have to call like 3 or 4 different APIs and take IDs from one and figure out how to plug them into another. That becomes actually really difficult to do, even though that those are totally reasonable productivity scenarios. So we're actually launching a preview this week of something we call the Unified API for Office 365. And that is on graph.microsoft.com, and it allows you to make queries against all of these different APIs from a single endpoint and to navigate through the entities in a really simple and seamless way. And it takes away a lot of the complexity of dealing with multiple APIs. So the whole demo that I just did, if I come back and do it in like 6 months when this thing is the way that we tell you to go and interact with the APIs, a lot of it will be very similar. The same sort of API signatures will be there, the same token, query string parameters will work and all that kind of stuff. But I'll be able to remove a bunch of stuff that I won't have to do multiple times in order to interact with these APIs. If you're interested in this particular piece of information, if you're interested in exploring the Unified API, Yina Arenas has a talk that's the next hour, I think it's like just across the hall or something, on how to use the Unified API in your applications. And she'll go into depth about what's in there right now, how you can use it. There's a public preview available so everybody can try it out. One thing I want to emphasize is it is actually the same platform. It's just simpler. So you can take those same APIs, the same APIs that you'll interact with through the Office 365 APIs are available through this unified endpoint. It's not a different API. It's not like you're going to rewrite your application. You're actually writing the same sort of requests and getting the same sort of responses just from a much simpler endpoint. You have one endpoint, one access token for interacting with it. So this is a really cool thing. We're incredibly excited about this, and this is definitely the direction that we're going for future API building. If you're interested in the details, go and check out Yina's session. Just a quick word on the roadmap. So we've had a bunch of APIs that have been generally available for a while. We have a bunch of new APIs that are available now in preview, the unified endpoint, the video portal, OneNote, and Yammer. Those are all things that you can try out in your production tenant today. We're working on a whole bunch of new stuff. We'll get those out as soon as we possibly can. We're actually moving really quickly at this point, so I think some of these you'll see very quickly, like within the next few weeks or a couple months. One of the big things we're doing is consumer and commercial unification. So today, if you want to build an app that calls OneDrive Consumer and OneDrive for Business, you're actually calling two different APIs and authoring to two different systems. You'll see in a couple months, it will actually be a simple, streamlined way to call that API regardless of whether the user is a consumer user or a commercial user. You use the same auth system, you use the same APIs against both those endpoints. And we'll do that for a bunch of different properties. OneDrive and OneNote and Exchange and Outlook.com. A whole bunch of different properties will make that convergence. We'll have an API here very soon for the Office Graph. There's actually a session on building apps with the Office Graph, so you can see details on that intelligent engine that tells you about relationships between users and groups. We'll have an API for managing tasks very soon. That's one of the most common ones we get is, do you have an API for managing tasks? Tasks turns out to be a very popular thing to do in productivity applications. Imagine that. And then the APIs for Lync and Skype will be integrated in this infrastructure very soon, too. OK, so that's a little bit on the roadmap. Now, we went through all those details. You guys are experts in OpenID Connect and OAuth now. But while it's really awesome that you actually understand it, and when things go wrong, it's incredibly useful to understand what's happening under the covers, most of the work that you do day to day probably doesn't actually require that you know it. If you actually had to go and use Fiddler to go get somebody's access token, your app would be awful slow. So we have a bunch of tools and SDKs that make your life much easier. You don't have to write every line of code to handle this. And the place to start is actually with auth, because auth, as you saw, is one of the more complicated, one of the more involved pieces here. And the Azure Active Directory guys have done an awesome job of building up a huge set of client libraries. They do it all in public on GitHub with open source SDKs. If you go to the AzureAD.org, you can find all of them. They're on a ton of different platforms, everything from like iOS and Android to Node.js and Xamarin and Cordoba and JavaScript. I mean, it's just a huge list. And this makes your life so much easier, you wouldn't believe, than writing any of this code by hand. And they handle all the special cases for you, all the things that you would usually have to worry about renewing access tokens based on refresh tokens because they expired and all that kind of stuff. So I definitely recommend taking advantage of these. I'm going to do a quick demo that I think will drive home just how much time you will save by using this. So I'm going to switch over. How many people have used Angular before? OK, decent amount of people. So I've got an app in Sublime. I actually really wanted to demo this from VS Code, which if you haven't used VS Code, it's really awesome. Only problem is it doesn't support snippets yet, so I couldn't actually do my snippet demo. But I've got a really simple, basic Angular app. I'll actually show you the Angular app running. Start my node server. And I'll go log into the app in this window. And you'll see that it's a really basic application. Right now, it actually doesn't do anything. It's got a title, and then it's got a bunch of headings for calendar events, messages, OneDrive for Business files. It's begging for actual data to be inside of those headings. If I go and look at the app, it's a really simple app. The frame page, if you're not familiar with Angular, basically you create this kind of frame page for the application. This is my frame page. It's got a reference to Angular and Angular route. And then it's got a reference to Azure Active Directory's authentication library for JavaScript, which if you're building single-page applications is indispensable. It will handle a ton of the auth stuff for you. And then what's really cool is this 8al Angular plugin, which if you're using Angular and Azure Active Directory, makes your life incredibly easy. I mean, I got this huge smile on my face. I almost kissed Vittorio. If you guys know Vittorio, Vittorio is the guy from Azure Active Directory. Oh, it's so cool. Then I go into app.js. This is where my application's logic is defined. I'm going to configure the application with a route provider. So this is kind of how you do navigation in a single-page app in Angular. I just have one route, which is at the root, invoke this home controller, which as you can see is empty right now, and then use this partials/home.html as the template for how to render it. Angular is an MVC kind of model in SPA. And it allows me to define, for example, here's what the view is in home.html. And you can see I've just got those headings and then an unordered list with all the calendar events inside of this collection, message inside of this collection. Obviously, right now there's nothing, so it's not rendering anything. So I'm going to go to the controller. Well, actually, first I'm going to write the auth code. And the auth code is actually really awesome, simple. Oh no, my snippets. Okay, well, I'm going to have to write the auth code this way because my snippets aren't working. See, I go and talk trash about Visual Studio Code not having snippets, and then Sublime totally craps out on me. Okay, so here's the code that I'm writing for auth. This is incredibly simple, and this is all I have to write for auth. I have this vs8al config thing. I have to tell it what tenant I'm a part of. I'm using that common thing to say this is a multi-tenant application again. Here's the client ID that I registered in Azure Active Directory. Here's a place where I can post extra query parameters to the authorization endpoint. In this case, I'm just saying show the new UX. They're kind of flighting a new user experience. And then here's endpoints. And endpoints is just a little JSON property bag that's telling me what are all the endpoints that you're going to make CORS calls to. And they'll handle this automatically. I'll explain in a minute what it does automatically. But they'll handle attaching access tokens to that automatically based on what I put in endpoints. And then the last piece of auth code I write is I go to the routes where I want people to have to be signed in, and I do require AD login is true. And I set that, and that's all the auth code that I write. Then I have to write the factories. And in Angular, a factory is what I use, or a service sometimes is what I use to go and get data. So I'm writing a factory here that's going to go and get calendar events, messages, files, and notebooks. You'll see I'm just using $HTTP, which is an Angular construct, and making a GET request to me/events, me/messages, me/files, me/notes/notebooks, and me/member of. I'm doing $top in all those, so I'm just doing a bunch of different queries to a bunch of different endpoints. And then the last piece is the controller, where they have this concept called $scope, which you can think of like the model, where I'm setting the model to be loading for all these things at first, and then I'm just invoking the factory and putting the properties on that model to be the response from that JSON. So I'm going to hit save, and I'm going to go back here, and I'm going to refresh it. And actually, I want to open the developer console so you can see all the requests. There we go. Okay. So I'm going to hit F5. So I'm actually hitting F5, and it handled all of that for me automatically. Literally, that was all the code I write. There wasn't anything else in there. And the reason that it worked, you can see all the requests going. Here's $files. Here's the notebooks and messages. So the reason that it worked is Angular 8al is actually smart enough to recognize when you do a $HTTP GET, this URL, outlook.office365.com, matches this URL. And anytime it finds a match, it says, oh, I need to go get an access token with a resource of this. And it automatically does all the rest of that stuff. And you'll actually see similar experiences. This is probably the slickest one for interacting with the Office 365 APIs. But you'll see similar experiences. In all those ADAL libraries, they make your life so much easier getting access tokens and refresh tokens. So don't ever write a line of code yourself on that piece. Use one of those libraries. For that demo, if you actually want to see the full code, you can just go. I have a GitHub repo, Rob M. Howard, O365 Angular cores. You can go check that out. One other thing that I'll show really quickly, just to kind of drive the point home there. This is actually just kind of a fun project that I did. There's this new video portal thing. How many people have used the video portal? OK, you guys should check out the video portal. It's really easy to describe. It's YouTube for the enterprise. So it's actually stored and managed in a place that's secure. It's authorized based on your access. I'm going to go inside of here, for example, and I'm going to go and open up my video portal. You actually, because it's my demo, you have to look at my samples, and it's all my daughter videos. So sorry, showing you kid videos, I know, in poor taste. So this is actually the video portal. I can go to channels. I can manage a bunch of different channels. I can look at specific channels. And then I can dive into a specific video. And what they're actually doing is they're taking that video up to Azure Media Services, and they're using Azure Media Services. So you get spectacular scale for how you are able to stream these out, because you get to leverage all the stuff that ran the NFL and the Olympics and all that good stuff. OK, So what I did was I was like, well, the video portal has a new API, and we've got all this new core stuff. How far could I actually get in kind of recreating this experience with Angular? And I actually have another repo next to that same one that you can go check it out that has this whole thing in it. And I'm going to go and close this node server and open this one. And again, this is just Angular. It's just HTML and JavaScript. And I'll load it right here. Oh, wait, nope, that's the wrong one. 1943. And there's a couple of things that aren't actually real, like the Chrome up here. This thing is just HTML. But the rest of this app is actually a live app. And it's using those O365 APIs. It's using cores. It's using Angular and 8LJS. And I can actually interact with it. I can go and look at pretty much the full experience. And it's just recreated that whole thing using just HTML and JavaScript. I can even actually stream the same video. And it all works end-to-end, because there's even APIs inside the video portal for doing things like getting a streaming token from Azure Media Services and an embed URL and all that kind of cool stuff. So a really complete set of APIs. I really want to drive home the message. You can do a bunch of really powerful stuff with these APIs. It's not just little toy demos. You can build complete solutions using these same APIs. OK, one last set of content to go through. In addition to Azure Active Directory libraries, we also have a bunch of Office 365 libraries. And we have an Office dev organization. If you haven't been up there, that GitHub repo has a ton of samples in it. Almost all the samples that we publish, we put open source in the GitHub repo. So you can find a bunch of samples there. You can also find our SDKs. And we have SDKs for iOS. We have SDKs for Android. For Android, we even have tooling inside of Android Studio where you can automatically register applications as part of a project. We have SDKs for Java Server, for Xamarin, plugins for Cordova. And of course, we have SDKs for .NET and really the best tooling for Visual Studio. The integration with Visual Studio is really awesome. I'm not going to go through an end-to-end thing because I don't quite have time, but I'm going to show you really quickly just the kind of stuff that the new Visual Studio tooling in 2015 can do for you. So I'm going to start off File, New Project. So this is a totally blank project. And if I go to ASP.NET Web Application and hit OK, right away you'll see change authentication. And one of the out-of-the-box forms of authentication is work and school accounts, which is going to let me sign in with Azure Active Directory, my Office 365 account or whatever Azure Active Directory account I have, into this particular web application. It's going to do all the configuration for me. It's going to go out to my tenant and register that application in the portal. It's going to create a new client ID and secret, download it, and put it inside of my web config. It's going to create a bunch of boilerplate code and add a bunch of NuGet packages in order to connect to all that stuff. I can check, say, I also want to be able to read directory data, not just get the signed-in user, and hit OK. And then when I hit OK, it'll go and create that web application and do all that configuration for me. In the RC build, it can take like 30 seconds or so to do it. So I've already got a built application here. Just to show you, I didn't actually do anything in this project. And if I go to web config, you can see here, here's the client ID, here's the AD instance, the client secret. All that stuff was configured just by going through that wizard. So pretty slick integration there. And if I hit F5, it'll, without me writing a single line of code, go and deploy that web app and allow me to do single sign-on with that web app. While that's loading, just in the interest of time, I'll come back and demo that, but I just want to demo one more thing, which is that's for doing single sign-on, right? That'll give me the user. It'll give me OpenID Connect. If I hit redirectory, it'll actually go back and use Azure Active Directory to get my profile. But if I want to call the Office 365 APIs, well, I'll just sign in real quick just to show you this. So I sign in with the application. You can see it's just the blank ASP.NET template. Once it's done loading all the DLLs. OK, it's just the blank ASP.NET template, but now it says, hello, rob@howard.cc. So I'm actually signed in and knows who I am. And I can click on this and go to a user profile that's using a controller that's actually calling out into Azure Active Directory and getting my name and my display name and showing that to me. So again, all that's configured for you just out of the box by that auth integration. Then if you want to call Office 365 APIs, there's also this add connected service experience. So I can right-click on a project and say add connected service. And I can see a bunch of different services here. This is a growing list, some from Microsoft. You can see Salesforce is in there now. I can choose Office 365 APIs and hit Configure. They promised me that by RTM, it's going to be integrated with the keychain, so I don't have to sign in again, but I do for the moment. And then it'll make sure I'm registered. It'll actually look in the project and look at all the URIs where it's going to deploy and say, are they actually registered reply URLs, so I can actually get an auth code on there. In this case, I don't want to change it. I can look at the app properties and manage whether it's a single or multiple organization thing directly from within Visual Studio. And then I can do things like say, oh, I want to actually get your My Files from OneDrive for Business and choose that permission from directly inside of Visual Studio. And when I hit Add, it'll go out to NuGet and get all the SDKs I need. It'll get the ADAL SDK, it'll get the My Files SDK for OneDrive for Business, and it'll add it into the project automatically and configure that project so I'm ready to go and write code. They'll actually, even right now, then launch a browser window to take you to documentation that tells you how to integrate that in MVC. By the time it gets to RTM, they'll even put some boilerplate code inside the application so that you'll have some sample code interacting with the Files API or the Calendar API or whatever you've added right when you add that connected service, and you can hit F5 and go ahead and run an application. Okay, so I'm almost out of time. That's kind of a real quick whirlwind around all the tooling that we have. There's a bunch of really powerful stuff. Hopefully you got the message that you don't actually have to go through all those steps every time you build an application. You can be much more productive. And Visual Studio definitely has the best experience there, but there are support for all of the platforms. One other thing that I'm told that I should mention in every session, we are, as part of the Office Developer Program, launching this new program that you can sign up for at dev.office.com/dev program if you want to get information about how to develop against Office, basically. There'll be email newsletters about new features that are coming out. We'll keep you up to date. When the Unified API goes general available, you'll be the first to know because you'll get an email there. You also get a free 1-year subscription to Office Developer, so you get a 1-year license there, which is pretty awesome. A bunch of training, even some free tools, like they're giving a free pro license to Kendo UI, and a free license to a service called Drip that helps you keep in touch with your app users, and a bunch of webinars. They're going to do interviews and webinars that'll be private to the developer program. So if you're interested in this stuff, I definitely recommend sign up for the dev program and go visit the booth and talk with folks about it as well. They've got a bunch of cool stuff to do there and some giveaways. In summary, please, please, please go back and bring Office 365 into your app. Let people sign in with that identity. Don't give them another username and password. Don't make them type in their username and password over and over again. Use OpenID Connect. Use your single sign-on to let them get in their cloud applications with their business ID. Then make your app smarter by pulling in Office 365 services, connecting them directly to information about where they are, who's in the organization, who they're related to. And don't do that manually. Go and use all these SDKs and tools and take advantage of it to be a really efficient developer and build applications really quickly and easily from the ground up. So thanks very much. I really appreciate your feedback. Please, please, please do take the time. Send me some feedback. Let me know what could be better. Let me know what was useful for you guys so we can make the talks better in the future. And thanks very much. I really hope you guys have a great rest of your build. If you have any questions, I'll be around here for a little while.